Hey folks, welcome to week 1 of AP Lit Vocab. As I mentioned before, each week, or most weeks, are going to have a theme, and this week we're going to review plot. So plot of, short stories or even novels, those kinds of things. So we're going to review parts of the plot diagram. So with no further ado, I am going to share my screen with you, and let's review together plot diagram. Here we go. This should be working shortly for you. And there, hopefully now you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, some of these will jam through really quick. Others we'll spend a little bit more time on, but most of these should be review for you. So first thing we're gonna review is plot. Remember, in any story, plot is the sequence of events in the story. It's the what happens. And the plot is built around a conflict because the conflict is what initiates the action and sort of propels the story as well. But plot, sequence of events in the story. It's the what happens. If you also remember, this is what a typical plot diagram looks like with the parts labeled on here. Again, I said typical because this is in a very perfect world, which we know many stories are not. And so we'll be reviewing these different parts of that plot diagram today. Here is that first part of the plot diagram is the exposition. And here it is going back to our picture. Remember, the exposition in a story comes at the beginning. It gives essential information like setting and characters. It might talk about previous events that are important to the story. And so it sort of sets us up in the beginning of the story. That's our exposition. Right after our exposition, we have our conflict. And we talk about this in a couple ways. A story typically has an initial conflict or an initial incident. And the initial conflict or incident, again, is kind of what gets the ball rolling. It gets the story started. Something has to happen to have the rest of the story. One example I'm thinking about for this is from the story, The Most Dangerous Game. And if you think back to freshman year, this is the story where Rainsford and his friend Whitney are traveling on a boat and they're going to go jaguar hunting. And Rainsford ends up falling off the boat in the night and he swims to the island. And him falling off the boat is that initial conflict, because without him falling off that boat, he would never have had to swim to the island. He would never have met Zaroff, who ends up hunting him, those kinds of things. So, initial conflict. We also have other conflicts throughout the rising action, and we can think about conflicts, all of these types of conflicts, in a number of ways. Remember, there's kind of 4 major types of conflict. Person versus person conflicts are those conflicts where you have one character pitted against another character. This could be in a physical nature, like literally a physical fight. They could have differing beliefs, for instance. Person versus nature conflict. Someone is contending with some element of nature. Person versus nature conflicts always make me think about the novel Hatchet. And Gary Paulson, he wrote The River as well, where characters often have, a plane crash and then they're stuck on a deserted island, those kinds of things. Person versus nature conflicts. Person versus self conflicts. This is where a character is dealing with some sort of conflict within him or herself. One of the things I often think about when I think of person versus self conflicts is addiction. Because although we could argue that, they're addicted to a drug, which is an outside force, a lot of the battle of addiction comes from the mental and the emotional battle. So character dealing with, a decision or some sort of conflict within. Finally, person versus society conflicts. These are those conflicts where a character has a belief that goes against the majority of people, and they might act on it. Examples include racism, religion, somebody being wrongly accused of a crime, or they're ousted from society. it's kind of the one against many mentality, if you want to think about that. Rosa Parks is a really good example of a person versus society. You know, she did something that went against the majority, what the majority at the time believed. Huck Finn is another text that makes me think about person versus society conflicts. You know, Huck doesn't want to conform, and he struggles with how his black friend Jim is treated, and this is very much against what others in society believe. Another way we can think about conflicts is internal conflicts versus external conflicts, and really these are just more broad terms. An internal conflict is that like person versus self conflict, where that conflict is inside of that person, versus an external conflict, that character is again pitted against an outside force, nature, a physical obstacle, or another character. Rising action is our next part of the plot diagram, and rising action, I think, is probably the most misunderstood part of this plot diagram, because typically when we see it, this is a straight line from our conflict to our climax, and rising action is anything but a straight line. There are so many ups and downs in our rising action, and our rising action takes up the majority of our story. Our rising action are the events in the story that move the plot along. They add complications, they expand the conflict. This is where our suspense is being built. So again, this is the bulk of our story in our rising action. Our rising action leads us to our climax. And our climax, there's really 3 different parts to our climax. The first part is that the climax is a turning point of the story. Okay, this is a turning point. Second, the climax causes a change in our main characters or character. Again, number 2 causes a change in the main character. And 3, the climax is the point where suspense reaches its peak. It's that highest point of emotion. So those are our 3 parts of our climax. Sometimes all 3 of those things in a story happen at one point. They all happen at the same moment. Sometimes those things happen at different points. Then we have sort of subcategories of the climax. We have the technical climax and the dramatic climax. And the difference is really basically all we do is we take the definition of 3 and divide it into 2. The dramatic climax is where that suspense is reaching its peak. It's that highest point. The technical climax then is the turning point of the story and the place where the main character is changing. So if that highest point of suspense and that change and that turning point are happening at different places, then we label them the technical climax and the dramatic climax. And again, here I just have climax labeled, but we could have, again, 2 different kinds of climaxes here. Falling action, very quick definition. It occurs after the climax of the story, and it explains the consequences or the fallout, hence falling action, of the climax. So again, explains consequences or fallout of the climax. After our falling action here, we have our next part, which is our resolution. And our resolution, right, has the word solution in it. It's pretty simple. It's how our problem is solved. We have to have a way that our main conflict or our main problems are solved. I think about Romeo and Juliet, and I think about the climax of that story being when Romeo kills Tybalt. That's our highest point of action when that happens. But our problem is not solved until the lovers kill themselves, because ultimately Romeo and Juliet want to be together, and ultimately there's this feud between the families, and neither of those 2 things are solved until the lovers' deaths in the tomb. And again, you can see our resolution here. Our last term on this plot diagram is one you are probably not familiar with. It's a new one for you. And this is called the denouement. The denouement. And literally, it's a French word, and it means untying. And so, okay, well, how does this relate to the plot diagram? Well, it refers to the untying of all the knots that have been woven throughout the literature, all of these subpoints, all of the things that have kind of been exposed. Now we're untying them and revealing them. The denouement usually occurs at the very, very end of a story, either the final scene, the final lines, the final chapter. It's where any sort of remaining secrets or questions or mysteries might be explained or revealed, either by the character, a character in the text, or by the author, him or herself. The denouement could also be an epilogue, where you have a part kind of after the main story that says something like 10 years later, and then explains kind of what the characters are doing and how the incident might have affected them. A couple quick examples of denouement. Again, there's denouement on our plot diagram. In Romeo and Juliet, these are the prince's last words of the play. And there's a couple of things he kind of tells us here, and one that's particularly important. He says, some shall be pardoned and some punished. So that not everybody, got the same thing out of here. Some are pardoned, some are absolved of their wrongdoing, and some will be punished. But in the end, this story is one of the saddest of all times, that of Juliet and her Romeo. And this sort of wraps things up at the end of the story. One other quick example is from the story Animal Farm. And in Animal Farm, essentially what happens is that there's a group of animals that have rebelled against their human masters, their human oppressors. But in the end, what almost happens is that the animals become what they were trying to avoid. And so the end of Animal Farm says, the creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. And so in these final lines, it's revealing that the other animals cannot distinguish between the pigs and the original oppressors. They've become one and the same. And it kind of wraps things up in the end as far as what happened. I have one more example on here from Life of Pi. I'm going to skip it. If you want another example in class, we can pull that up when I see you. Our next literary device, and this should also be a new one, is called Deus Ex Machina. Deus Ex Machina. And it is a Latin word, and it literally translates to God out of the machine. And the term comes from ancient Greek theater. And what they would do is they would take a crane and they would lower an actor dressed as a god onto the stage. And this would happen near the end of the play. And the purpose of that god was that the god was meant to sort of set things right, make things right. And so this is where the original term came from. Well, how do we see that in modern literature? Well, for a plot to be a Deus Ex Machina, it has to be a solution. There's going to be a solution. It has to be sudden or expected. And there has to be a point in the story where things seem hopeless, that the problem seems unsolvable. They're never going to get home. They're never going to get rescued. It cannot be solved in a positive way. And so something sort of swoops in and solves the problem out of the blue. One of those examples in a movie is in The Wizard of Oz. Right? Dorothy is in Oz. She thinks she's never going to get home. And then she learned from the wizard that she really had the power all along within her shoes to wish herself home. So this sort of solution swoops in kind of out of nowhere to solve her problem. Probably one of the best examples I can think of with Deus Ex Machina is Lord of the Flies. Because near the end of this book, the boys are on this island. They are wreaking havoc. There's a fire. They're killing each other. And it seems like they're all either going to die. They would have self-destructed. Things are not going to end well. All of a sudden, at the end of the novel, a naval officer, out of the blue, shows up on the island. And that naval officer acts as a solution. That naval officer is sudden or unexpected. And the boys were in a situation that seemed unsolvable or hopeless at that point. So that naval officer in this situation at the end of Lord of the Flies, we could label as Deus Ex Machina. Another term that might be new for you is the term anticlimax. And this is where you have a story kind of typically building, right? You're going through that rising action and things are getting intense and there's this idea of suspense and you think the climax is going to be this major event. It's going to be this battle to end all battles. But when you get to that point that should be the climax, it is less powerful, less important, less striking, less intense than you'd ever expect, and perhaps even disappointing. One example I can think of with this is the book and the movie, The War of the Worlds. And what's happening is there's this extraterrestrial takeover of Earth. And so essentially aliens are taking over and they're destroying the Earth. So things are building up, right? And you think maybe that something could defeat them and could wipe out these aliens. But there's this moment of anticlimax because the aliens are defeated by none other than the common cold. So this moment of climax is much less important or striking than to be expected. One other example is from a horror movie. And so you see sort of scenes like this set up all the time, right? This boy's in this house and he hears scratching at a door in his house. So he approaches that door, right? He's going to open it. There's going to be some sort of creature behind that door. But he puts his hand on the doorknob and he turns the knob to open the door and he discovers his cat. Right? That moment is much less important, has much less intensity than you might expect, and that's called an anticlimax. The last two terms I'm going to go over today are protagonist and antagonist, two terms that you probably are very familiar with. The protagonist in a novel, remember, is usually the central character. Oftentimes they're the hero type character. They're also the one that the audience can identify with because we need to feel something towards one of the characters, and that usually is the protagonist. The protagonist drives the plot. The protagonist makes things happen. Then in contrast, the antagonist is the character or whatever is in opposition to the protagonist. And I say or whatever because the antagonist does not have to be a character. The antagonist could be something like a force of nature or an aspect of society or a force within the protagonist himself or herself. And so together, the protagonist and the antagonist create the conflicts within the story. And so here's just a couple of quick examples I pulled up of, protagonists and antagonists, where you have either a hero and a villain or a good and a bad, somebody you're rooting for and somebody you don't want to win, with protagonist and antagonist. So that will take us to the end of our words for today. Please make sure you take notes. The beautiful thing about having these on video is that you can go back and watch anything if I went too quick or you need to review later on. But please take notes. Please bring questions to class, and I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.